Okay, well, welcome everyone to today's webinar for Engineering and Operations Management, our Lunch and Learn webinar series. Glad that all of you could join us today. If you do have to hop off early, just know that this session is being recorded, and a link to the video on our YouTube channel will be sent out to everyone who registered in case you have to jump off or get disconnected, depending where you are in the United States right now. I know a few people are getting hammered by hurricanes, so some are having electricity issues or connection issues and things like that. So we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Karen Hickenbotham. I'm the program manager for the Masters in Science and Operations Management, as well as our 3 graduate certificates. So welcome today. Today, our presenter is Dr. Rich Ham, Associate Director in the department. He is a seasoned executive with 39 years of experience in international operations and security management. He designs and teaches courses on Homeland Security, resilience and crisis management, cybersecurity, unmanned aircraft systems, leadership, and regulatory enforcement. Dr. Ham holds certificates as a pilot, air traffic controller, and remote pilot, and executive certificate in security from Tel Aviv University. Dr. Ham retired from the United States Air Force after a distinguished career, including regulatory oversight of security contracts for aircraft flying to Europe, airport operations, and air traffic control. He joined the Transportation Security Administration, holding numerous positions and ultimately serving as the executive charged with all regulatory compliance and enforcement. He was instrumental in management of the underwear bomber and Yemen printer bomber plots, as well as the author of the agency's compliance risk management model. Dr. Ham pioneered 2 canine programs. The first established the first use of canines for wildlife control measures on military airfields. The second created the first canine passenger screening program, which is now used internationally. Dr. Ham is credentialed and serves as Senior Law Enforcement Advisor for the State Department Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program around the globe. He has an active research agenda and has been a contributor to book chapters on the use of drones, publications in peer-reviewed journals on aviation risk and cybersecurity, as well as numerous publications. Dr. Ham is sought after and a presenter at numerous conferences on security and drone operations. So everyone, please help me welcome Dr. Ham. Thank you very much today for being here, and I'm going to hand the controls over to you.
Well, thank you, Karen, and thank you everybody that joined today. I think the topic today is something I think all of us are probably looking over the last several months and wondering if we had quite as good a handle as we thought on how we designed our systems resiliently, or even our personal life. Today, what I hope that we'll do is help you understand a little bit about the kind of processes that you can use in order to build resilience and also your capacity, both personally and for your job, to manage in a crisis. I think this first quote from Benjamin Franklin really speaks to what most of us find out when we're in the middle of a crisis. And this current crisis, the pandemic and other things that are happening around the world, I think have highlighted those to many of us, believing maybe we should have spent a little bit more time in these areas. When Benjamin Franklin said, if you fail to plan, then you're planning to fail, certainly that would hold true on many of the processes and things we see today. To bring it a little bit closer to home, my grandmother, who grew up basically on a farm, used to say, don't put all your eggs in one basket. And so these are concepts that, although we've used some pretty good academic models to help us understand how we can design more resilient systems and manage in crisis, it's been thought about throughout history on how we will do things in order to ensure that one crisis or one issue with one of our systems doesn't cause us to fail, or at least reduces the consequence. Really, the starting point for any discussion on resilience and crisis management is, first off, define what we're talking to. And if we define resilience as the ability to recover from or adjust to misfortune or change, and then have systems that can withstand, respond to, and recover from attacks or hazards and reduce that effect of uncertainty that we had prior to the incident. It helps us kind of understand the things that we do every day. So if, for many of us, if we think of some simple things, if you ensure that you carry a spare tire in your car in case you have a flat, that is one of the simple things that you would do to ensure that you're resilient, that you can respond to that flat in a way that you can continue to your destination. Even sometimes more difficult to understand is what a crisis is, and we find ourselves often with confusion between managing a crisis and managing an emergency, and what is really the difference in those two, and how do we look at our systems so that we can do that effectively. If you wait until you're in the middle of the crisis, then you have already failed. Going back to what Benjamin Franklin said, you have to spend time before the crisis occurs. So we talk about crisis, and we define that as the identification of threats or to an organization's and sometimes survival, or to a function and the stakeholders that you have in your venue or in your facility or in your process, and then those methods and techniques to deal with those threats or attacks to help reduce the effect of that during a crisis. That's what we're talking about in crisis management. Those are closely related in our resilient design. We would say if we wanted to look at the two, we would define resilience as what we do in advance to ensure that we have a system that will allow us to adjust. And then crisis management is those processes that we've designed so that while we're in the crisis, we can manage those. There's a few terms that I've put here that you'll often hear people use, and they sometimes get used interchangeably, and there's some confusion on that. I hope to clear some of that up today in the way that we would define it. Sustainability is something we hear often spoken about, and certainly in academic circles, about how do we have a system or how do we design things to sustain the way that we would go forward and be able to function without having an issue with a failure because we didn't plan. So if you think of some simple things throughout history, things that have been learned, things like in agriculture, the rotating of crops. That's really before the term sustainability came into vogue. That's really what that was about. The ability to rotate crops so that you wouldn't take all the minerals out of the soil, you would replenish them, and was discovered hundreds of years ago as a way to sustain. When we look at other areas, though, like emergency plans and response plans and the difference with a contingency, sometimes those get really fuzzy. We try to understand what does that really mean. So, today when we look at some of those, we hope to help understand how does the normal function work when we are designing, when we have a system that has resilience built in, but then also how do we respond afterwards. Another simple one, if any of you are doing investing, and we talk about designing resilience into how we prepare for our retirement, if I can all but guarantee if you've got a money manager, they talk to you all the time about diversifying your portfolio. The idea being that you don't have, using that quote from my grandmother, all of your eggs in one basket, so that if something does occur, then you're able to survive and press forward. So the first thing that's often helpful is for us to look and see what's the history that supports that we really need to have resilient design and to manage a crisis. So these are a few that we would see. Certainly, I think that the pandemic is at the top of the list for many of us now, unless you live on the Gulf Coast, and probably you're thinking hurricanes right now, and whether or not you board it up to add resilience and survivability of structures. If you had water, what you would do when you lost electricity, how did you plan during that time? But the course or the holistic view of these is that they're all interrelated. So all of us have probably seen and were certainly surprised about some of the things that occurred, as an example, with this pandemic, with this current crisis. One of them is what happened with supply chains. There weren't very many people that would have predicted that the issue, one of the major supply chain issues that would happen during a pandemic would be a shortage of toilet paper. But certainly it was, and that in itself sometimes, because of the fact that it presents itself, then causes people to hoard toilet paper, which increases the possibility of having a crisis. So there's nothing to do after you're in the middle of it. Now you're hoping that you have systems to manage the crisis and adjust, but you need to have a model on how you would adjust. One of the things that we know when it comes to whether we're talking about supply chains or we're talking about other areas that occurred, whether it's the pandemic or areas of civil unrest or anything that's happening, is that many times you never come out at the other end, and you shouldn't come out at the other end with a normal situation back to where you were before. There has to be an adjustment, and you have to look at the data and then decide what should you do differently. So if any of you are in supply chain or you know somebody in supply chain, if you spend talking to those professionals that are working in various supply chain modes, they'll tell you that many of the models that they had prior to the current crisis are either adjusted to where they're almost unrecognizable, or they're brand new models because they found new data, new issues, new things that occurred, and they had to respond accordingly. That response is everything from increased home delivery to issues that they would, or things that they would have to look at and how they would predict and look at their supply chain. You know, what is each of their suppliers' resilient design? You clearly, if you've only got one supplier for a critical piece, you've got a problem. One of the famous case studies that happened during the tsunami in Japan some years ago was a crisis that some of the Japanese car manufacturers had in this country. One was that they were building the automobiles here, had spread that out to several plants, not just one plant. That's a good resilient design. But they had an issue with windshields. The windshields for many of the models, the only place that supply came from was Japan. So they had a period of time where they could build an entire automobile but had no windshields to put on them. So obviously now that's not the case. They're looking at how their suppliers work and how they work on, or how they would adjust if they had something happen there. And we talk about some others like data breaches. The current models, if you look at a model, whether it has to do with physical security or responding to a hurricane or how you build resilience, data breaches are certainly one of them. They're all but you can expect you're going to have many data breaches. Data breaches will occur. We depend upon the ability to do things in a digital fashion. When the breach does occur, though, how do you respond to that? Did you build your system in a way that it's only localized to a certain amount of information? And then how do you not only stop it, but then make sure that it doesn't happen in the future? So who do we think needs this type of skill set, that needs to understand resilience and crisis management principles? Well, there's a list here, and I think that everybody would agree that is each of these lists. Certainly there's operations managers that look at how they design, not just to a crisis or a worldwide crisis, but how they build every day to deal with a small crisis. So if you can think of your system being able to accommodate small changes, small amounts of uncertainty and adjust, and then expand those out to a system, you have a pretty good foundation in order to establish long-term resilient functions where you'll be able to respond or you'll be able to recover. Obviously, in business, those that manage emergencies, somebody looking at how as an engineering manager, military leaders, government leaders, supply chain that we talked about already, human resource specialists. This is an area that often has been neglected, not a lot of time spent on how do we ensure that we're resilient for our workforce. And certainly we found this out during this current crisis, in that you needed to make sure things that, hey, if you did have to go to remote work, do all of your individuals that are key have the infrastructure? If they do have infrastructure and you move them off of site, then are they able to have, or are they able to get to some of your secure networks, those things that typically you only allow internally? And if not, what's the impact of that? Sometimes you have to accept some degradation, or you have to accept risk in the ability to have a hack or something else that would occur, that you would lose data in order to continue to operate. Almost every major, not just the government at all levels, but virtually every major Fortune 100 company now has an operations center that's monitoring what's happening and then making adjustments, and then going to key decision makers to decide, should we accept a degradation? Should we change the way that we work everywhere? Should we shift these operations to another location? And when you have regional efforts or a regional crisis, those things, they're never easy, but they certainly present solutions that you can design for resilience by moving functions around. When it's global, now you have an entirely different matter, and you have to have spent some time. And not many people spent time looking at, what if this affects me, not just in this region or in this country, but everywhere. Obviously, law enforcement and security, they spend a lot of time in this area, and university leaders. So if you're in higher education, or for that matter, even K-12, and you had to, in the course of just a few weeks, transition to an online format, I think many in education thought, well, we probably never thought this was possible, and therefore we didn't spend a lot of time thinking about what would the long-term implications be. Do we have the capacity to do it? If we do, are my human resources up to it? Can they function that way? And then certainly public health. But the bottom line is, everyone has to understand some. And I think if you look and examine what you do day to day, you've probably already done these things without really thinking about it. You've, stockpiled toilet paper. You've come up with ways to do home delivery. You've used other tools to add your own resilience. In virtually everything that you do, the question becomes, have we done that in a way that we can reproduce it, and that we have a process that we can follow? So everything that we do, when we look at models, and certainly in our program, but if you look at the organizations and both government and then industry organizations, we look at a model, an overarching principle that we always want to use as we design systems. So if we look at these principles, the Plan, Do, Check, Act model is relatively easy to help us visualize what are the things that we should do. And so if we start with the first step, to plan, that includes preparation. So we write the plans for normal, emergency, and contingency operations, so that everybody would know what would we do if this was to occur. We'd also define what is our risk tolerance. How much risk would we accept? How much would we decide that we could take and continue to operate? And then identify those threats and consequences or impacts that would occur, and how much of that we can accept. So there's many models. The Department of Homeland Security and FEMA has a model. There's many academic models. And honestly, as long as you have a model that works, that you can show over time, it's not as important the exact model that you use as that you use an accepted model and then apply it and then practice it. Then we operate every day, and then something occurs and we devise and implement the solutions in a systematic fashions. Sometimes that means we pilot different types of work. Sometimes it means that we actually try 2 or 3 different pilots to see what works best, and then after we make a decision, we move towards that. We check that. That means we measure. We can measure those with quantitative, pseudo-quantitative, or qualitative methods. We can use simulations. We can test ourselves. We can simulate that we have entered this system. Now let's test it, and then we can go back and look at how we performed. You identify what works and what didn't work, identify the vulnerabilities within that, and then you come up with solutions to solve that problem. You act to reduce the consequences, the threats, or the vulnerabilities, and you start again. And it goes in a circle. This would be a model. We often use several different models, but one from the American Society of Industrial Security. They have the operations risk management model, and they use the plan, do, check, act model in order to try and understand what are the things that we could do so that we can continually be and improve, check ourselves, make sure we understand what the risk is, and then manage that risk so that we can add organizational resilience to everything that we do. This is kind of the normal way that we think of things, and I'll make a couple of distinctions here. Normal operations in several of the areas that are listed here, this is day-to-day, as your normal operation. We define an emergency operation as something that's short-term. I have something that occurs. I had an aircraft crash. I had an accident where somebody was injured. You will come up with immediate fixes, ways that you can get through that short-term emergency, and then you measure that effectiveness. But the idea is you're going to come back to normal. Contingency operations, those are more long-term. They have to be sustainable. You sometimes accept reduced capability during that time, but the whole idea is that you are going to eventually go to normal operations. So let's talk about a couple of examples here, and I would use an example. The attacks of September 11th. We had normal operations, and they had a lot of vulnerabilities in the way that the aviation security system worked. And we operated day to day, and it looked like it was going to be fine, and most of us were used to that kind of that level of screening. And then 9/11 happened. Well, short term, if some of you remember that were around then, what that meant was the National Guard deploying. It meant opening every bag when you flew. It meant long lines. It meant untested systems. And it meant legislation to have the government take over all of the screening operations. It wasn't sustainable. It was the only way to get flying again, but it wasn't sustainable. The contingency operation that developed was longer term. A new agency, new equipment, new ways to use intelligence. We had a period of reduced capability. You could no longer take certain things on the airplane with you. You had to submit to different checks to make sure that you weren't attached to a terrorist organization, but we were able to continue and have a contingent operation. Here's where it starts to get, and we have to pay a lot of attention as we look at this type of a model. Every time we transition from normal to emergency, emergency to contingency, and then making adjustments on our contingency operations that become the new normal, those transitions are the key nodes. And so some of the things that you have to consider when you make those is when you transition, first off, did you do it based on data that you know, on a plan that you've tested? Did you, if you have a contingency operation, did you look at what the long-term effects were going to be to operate in that degraded mode? Did you look at things, for instance, if we look at now the transition out of some contingency, and quite honestly, some of these are now becoming the new normal, did we consider all those things when we transition? So if it's the new normal, and I'm saying I'm going to not eliminate, but certainly reduce some of the degradation in operations I would have, is my supply chain, is my human resources, is my technology, can I get back to normal operations and get back to where I had the same capability in that transition? Interestingly enough, what we see is most individuals, because they understand the implications, they are slow to transition to emergency operations. They quickly want to get to contingency operations because they want to get some kind of normalcy involved, and they quickly want to enter into a normal operation with those contingencies being developed. And what happens over time is you'll find these are the places that weaknesses happen. There's another attack, or there's something where it wasn't considered effectively, or the system wasn't considered as a whole. You make some actions in one area, and you'll find it will affect other areas, and that consideration wasn't made, especially during transitions. So just a few areas to consider. Our day-to-day life, obviously, but the way, let's say in a business that we comply with Homeland Security compliance operations, we teach that in one of our courses, all the different programs that you're required in business to do, especially in supply chain, how our supply chain functions, what's happening with our workforce. Are they able to sustain for long periods of time? Some of you have probably already noticed that even if you overcome technology issues with human factors, there are some folks that are really that struggle with a lack of contact or a lack of feedback daily, or an issue where they don't understand what it is they're expected to do in this new normal. Spend a lot of time in resilience and crisis management, making sure that you're communicating and ensure that they have an idea of the direction that you're headed or organization's headed. In global competition or global operations, this even is more difficult because now you find out you have cultural barriers that you have to deal with, or you're dealing with what other countries have decided that they will implement, and now you're trying to use your action, or you're trying to mesh your actions with theirs. Obviously, technology, drones, I'll put that there because it's one of the things that I work on. But right now I can tell you as an example, the increase in drone operations has been accelerated. Acceleration of delivery for supply chain, because fewer and fewer people feel safe right now in going out. The use of drones to do everything from actually sterilizing areas, or being used to do things that we used to have people do. Ultimately, in the end, you're looking to manage risk. That's the bottom line. And this just barely scratches the surface, but it's the kind of things that we need to spend time looking at. So how do we manage that risk? Well, we can look to prevent the attacks, whether intentional, unintentional, or natural. Sometimes your people don't understand how important something is, and they open you up for a vulnerability. Obviously, terrorists, that's something that we think about, but intentional criminals or hackers, we can't do a lot to prevent natural hazards. We can't do much in an all hazards approach to that. So we have to focus where we can reduce consequences. You can protect by hardening your facilities, hardening your digital defenses, using adaptation strategies, access control, many things that you can do to try to protect against hazards. And in this step, you can do things in natural hazards by the way that you build. You have building codes that are earthquake resistant, or that are outside of floodplains, those sorts of things. You can also look then to reduce those consequences, and that's part of mitigation. how much exposure you have, using layers of security when you're looking at the types of attacks that we would think that might be intentional, but certainly not just security, the layers of safety, and making sure that you can break the chain of those failures. And then how you respond. Often the best way, especially for things that you can't control much on the left-hand side of a process, but only as it flows to the right, is how you recover, recuperate, and maintain continuity. So if we think about natural disasters, we certainly can do some things to prepare, and we can do some things to harden and prepare or prevent. We can do those, but in the end, we can't stop it from happening, but we can have response mechanisms, forward deploy materials that may be needed, evacuations that will help individuals to survive and then come back and help. So the way we recover and respond certainly is one of the things that can help us reduce the consequences. These are really busy charts, but I think they're good to demonstrate a couple of things. Just looking at the likelihood and severity, or severity is sometimes termed as impact or consequence, we can see several different types of scenarios, all of which place at different or occur in different places of the matrix. So we look at how they replace on the matrix, and then we realize a couple of things. One is that they are interdependent often. They often cause us to make a decision for one area to reduce either the consequence or to add resilience that will cause other problems. There's several examples. There certainly are in the security realm, but there are also issues associated with that in natural disasters. A great example would be the last hurricane and the flooding that occurred in Houston. They being emergency managers, were having to make decisions to open levees that were to purposely flood parts of the area around Houston. And the idea became, you can flood one area with 1.5 feet and cause some damage, but if you continue to allow the levees to hold everything back, then other areas are going to be catastrophically flooded and completely destroyed. So there's this balance between the two areas that you're looking at, so that you're making a decision and then weighing those consequences about which would have the least overall effect anytime that you're involved in a crisis. The bottom, and I think it's a pretty good way to try to look at mitigation strategies, but on the bottom, when we look at things that we can do, if we have a very low impact and something has almost zero or very small consequences to us, but the likelihood that it'll occur is high, often we can use some strategies to educate and communicate, train our people, use instruments to where people can look and understand why they need to do something differently. Conversely, if we have something that's a severe impact on the right-hand side at the bottom, or very going up to the top high and kind of that top right hand, those we have to act firmly now and do some pretty direct, severe things, or design things that are more draconian in nature. If we have a low probability and a low consequence, it's unlikely to happen, and then if it does, it doesn't mean much, then we don't really have to do anything except monitor and see if anything is happening. So we do have to spend some time, but we don't have to spend as much, and we would not put a lot of resources there. As we look into the severity in the bottom right, this is the one where it's very interesting and individuals often struggle with, and that's when something has a low probability but a severe consequence, and you have to do some things to respond. Sometimes you self-regulate and add some internal processes. Sometimes what you'll do is just to depend upon how you plan for the contingencies. to survive. The reason that sometimes this is the most dangerous of all is its consequence is severe, but it's so low that the kind of inherent response is to just hope it doesn't happen. Any organization that does that normally is in trouble, because what will happen is it may be low risk or low probability, but it's not impossible probability. And so some of these things will occur even if they're infrequent, and you have to be able to respond. So you can look at some of the businesses now and that are having a very difficult time trying to respond because they really, in many cases, felt it was a low risk and they didn't spend a lot of time trying to plan for that contingency. This is kind of how an organization works normally. And if we looked at industry, what we would see is that we have risk, and this is a model from Malcolm Sparrow at Harvard, but he talks about the kind of things that we do day to day. And, we have compliance that really in many things that we're asked to do, that the government asks us to do, we have no control over that. It's a requirement we have to do to, avoid fines or to avoid other consequences. But many of them don't do very much to buy down risk. They do some things, they have other purposes, but they don't really buy our risk down much. Then we have internal policies that we do that they kind of help us to comply in some of these areas, but often we're just straight doing compliance, and our kind of internal self-regulation is based on a lot of other things. It could be based on philosophy. It could be based on some things that the strategic plan for the organization holds, but it really doesn't buy down very much risk, and it doesn't really help us very much in our compliance area. What we want to do is spend time designing our internal processes so that we can contain the risk. And we spend time, if you notice the circle's smaller, we want to reduce risk. We reduce our vulnerabilities, those places that could be exploited against us, or we reduce the consequences to keep the risk down. And we want to contain our internal processes to not be wasted, but to focus as much as we can on compliance and risk, so that we're not doing things that have they add no value to our organization in these two areas. So we do a lot of things to help us here. One is that we do concentric designs or layers of security. This is one from an entry control plan that uses everything from behavior detection, access control, different types of security and detection and technology. But the idea is each one of these, we can use different tools like an event tree, or we can use some tools, just a simple matrix, so that we can look at what do we think that our probability would be of each of these failing. And obviously, none of them are perfect. The idea becomes that you want to make sure that you have designed to where if you don't have a single point of failure. You're going to design systems to where if even if something's 90% effective, I certainly think people flying would not be happy to if somebody told them, well, we think there's we're pretty good about 85% of the time we can catch bombs before they go through the checkpoint. If that's the only thing that was dependent upon, or only one piece of technology that might be aging, or you might have issues associated with how many people can be involved in the process, it wouldn't be acceptable. But if you use other things like looking at people before they show up, or looking at a way to make sure a post checkpoint, or using canines and randomization processes so that you can increase that, then you've reduced the possibility that you're going to have a failure. So security in safety follows the same kind of model. We would be able to respond, and then if we have a failure, even if it's a small failure, we have other layers that can step in and take care of that. So many people will ask, we in our program, as an example, we have a new course. We have a course that's going to be an 8-week 2 on resilient design and crisis management, and really it's to help us understand these, how do different lines of business, how we look at this holistically, and do we make decisions, understanding that all the systems are interrelated. We align those responses with the National Incident Management System that FEMA sets forward, and often you'll hear individuals say, "Well, that's really a government thing," but that's just not true. If you're in any type of the programs that are regulated by the government, and supply chain is heavily regulated by both safety and security, whether it's hazmat or things with Homeland Security, they require the plans that are submitted, the contingency plan, to be NIMS compliant. So you have to understand, even in industry, how do you design your systems in a way so that they're resilient, they can respond, and that you have layers built in to be approved. In some industries, you actually have to have the government approve your plan. In others, it's just given to you as part of the plan, and then you have to design it, and then you're subject to be inspected. Regardless, though, almost every organization that I've ever engaged understand that what they need to do is have a way to respond, have plans, test those plans, and then always be building them and improving them. So the bottom line, at least for our program, is we like to say we practice what we teach. Even before the COVID crisis, we were looking at this course because of things and how it fits together with different certificate sets, or how it would build with skill sets that both employers and some of our students have said they needed. So we've added this course as part of the electives that students could take. We have a Homeland Security certificate that's in process, and it is in the process of changing to allow even more flexibility for students based on what they need. So if somebody looks now and they say, I'm not really a supply chain person, that's a core, and they would apply, they could look at using some of these other areas. Perhaps they think they understand supply chain really well. And what they really think they need is, after they understand the overview of operations management and Homeland Security compliance requirements, maybe they need to understand more about people and what causes a mistake. And human factors is a great one to see how you would do a root cause analysis for that. Or maybe they want to understand risk management. There's an OM course for that uses some non-calculus based systems. And for those that want to look at some more advanced, we have an OMGT calculus based risk course that would help students find a way to manage risk and to quantify that in a way that decisions can be made. And obviously some look at using UAS for different types of functions. So there's a lot of electives, and there's a lot of choices to learn how to do the principles and apply those across a line of business. Here are the general things that you could expect to look at in our course, and what we look. One is policy and the effect of policy in each of these areas, planning and preparations. Next, public health is one of several. So obviously pandemics would be viewed. Whole community preparedness, that's everything from how do we use the entire community to help to build our resilience. Some may not realize that part of the risk evaluation now in, say, for example, in anti-hijacking is the passengers themselves. Passengers no longer sit still. If someone tries to do something nefarious, they actually engage, and they're part of the solution. So whole community preparedness, whether it's helping to prepare for floods, storm shelters, that's all part of the process. Exercising, that includes testing. Some would say red teaming, where you actually test each of your different, look at vulnerability assessments. When we look at whether it's through testing or evaluation, qualitative and quantitative, and how do we manage that risk. And then the next to the last, emergency operations, command and control. Those are how you communicate, who's in charge. You'd be surprised the number of times I've dealt with emergencies and crisis throughout my life that you stand there and everybody looking around wondering who really has the authority to make the decision. And then we try that all together with how private partnerships work together with the government and using an all hazards holistic approach to reduce the effect of a crisis. Here's the kind of things, at least in our course, and I think you'd see in other similars, we would talk about how you prep and plan, how do you organize, how you design. What are the things that you could do to maintain continuity? Obviously, plan, do, check, act. We spend a lot of time, and then case studies of both good and bad that occurred in the past, because if we use history, we can learn a lot. We follow government and ASIS standards and NIST standards, as well as best practices to help you make critical analysis. The thing that we often, though, that I think of any of these courses we've used lately is we have thought leaders, and these are many of them internationally acclaimed, certainly nationally acclaimed thought leaders that come in to give ideas about what they believe was good or bad in previous crisis, or in what was bad, good or bad about resilient designs. The bottom line is everybody needs it. I think that at some level, whether it's through a course or a certificate, or whether it's a self-study, this is definitely something that's here to stay, and we all need to spend some time understanding how those systems work and developing some skill sets, whether it's supply chain or technology or maintaining the safety of data. All of these things are important. Standalone courses and certificates help you to add depth and breadth in each of these areas, but there's certainly some other areas you can use, even some free resources. So, Karin, that concludes my talk, and I'm certainly happy to take any questions when we get to that point.
Right. Well, Dr. Ham, thank you very much. That was very informative, and I hope everyone enjoyed that presentation as much as I did. We will be taking questions not through the raise hand feature, but if you look at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see kind of a purplish menu. If you utilize the chat section there, if you want to start typing your questions, I'm going to just briefly go through while everyone is formulating their questions and getting those in. We do have the Masters of Science in Operations Management. Just at a glance here, we are 100% on live. We do have live classes, which currently are very restricted due to the pandemic. We have in-state tuition for everyone. There is no out-of-state tuition. We have 10 graduate course program that equals 30 hours. Up to 4 prerequisites may be required depending on your previous coursework. We operate in 5 8-week sessions per year, which is also not just for enrollment, but for admission purposes as well. You can pair the master's degree with the graduate certificate, specifically with the one Dr. Ham just mentioned with Homeland Security, with no extra hours required. Those are basically taken concurrently. There is no GRE or GMAT required with the 3.0 bachelor's GPA, and our total program cost is anywhere between $12,000 and $15,000, of course, depending on the prereqs needed as case-by-case basis as your transcripts are evaluated. We do have a special COVID-19 announcement effective for fall 2020 8-week 2 and spring 2021 terms. At this time, we are waiving the GRE for applicants with a 2.5 to a 2.99 GPA. Anyone with above a 3.0 is, of course, automatically waived. Once the testing centers can resume normal operations, the standard admission requirements will go back into full effect. Just a glance here, our graduate certificates that the MSOM department offers is in project management, Lean Six Sigma, and of course the one that Dr. Ham just mentioned, Homeland Security. So no questions in the chat messages just yet. So if you do have one, you can either email Dr. Ham or myself. I will be giving that information out. Our next webinar is October 7th. On a Wednesday, same time, noon Central Standard Time, on change management, increasing the odds of adoption, presented by, Mr. Travis McNeil, who's also an MSOM instructor. We also have our next info session will be a week from today on September 23rd. Special topic is going to be in advanced project management. I'll have with me MSOM instructor Phil Jones to speak on that topic as well. If there are no questions at this time, there we go. Andrew's popped up with one. So Dr. Ham, Andrew has, how would you deal with the long-term risk to firms operationally with work at home?
Well, that's a great question, Andrew, and one that many are struggling with. The number one, so I could break it into several things. Obviously, in the resilient design for HR, some of those things are changing the way that checkups on people happen locally. How do you how do you check with them? Are there ways that you can do to have other contacts? But when you're working at home with issues specifically associated with, and I'll just tell you some examples that I've seen that individual descent. You've got different types of data sets that are very sensitive, proprietary, and that is an issue that you have trouble even with the VPN at home. They access. So many of the companies that have been successful have done one of two things. They've either rotated people through and designed how to, if I think it's unsafe, if I can't accept the risk and the degradation by allowing access offsite because of the data sets that I have, or in some cases, there's just not enough capacity because of the requirements for servers. Some of them have developed rotation schemes where you have a team of 10, then you have 1 day every 2 weeks that you come in and do that type of work. And then others have developed ways that they designate one person that can sanitize information that they do feel that can be used to do most of the work remotely. So it's not an easy, resilient design. Certainly it wasn't considered before now, but it's something that should. I think everybody's looking at it from now. Interestingly enough, some of the resilient design types of ideas that are coming out of the remote work, that if you read and what's being published, and if you look at examples and case studies, are looking to likely go to more remote. So there's this idea, and it's pretty much true in anything you look where it's diversification or moving things away, that if individuals are home, then the problems that you would have at central locations, some are reduced. There's everything from work sharing, working people around, having them do the sensitive work there from, by rotating in, to designating just one employee that does some of that and then helps and coordinates through the others. Not a simple answer, and not something without specifics I can't get to very much, but I will tell you that what you're doing, and I suspect that you've heard many firms talking about it, is something that's happening all over now. And when we talk about, if you look at the model about that transition time from contingency to normal operations, your question goes right to the heart of that. Has the consideration been, okay, we accepted this degradation for a period, are we going to just roll that over as part of our new normal? Transition time of making that decision is critical in how firms assess that risk.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Dr. Ham. If there are no more questions, we are winding up, ending the lunch hour. And Andrew, thank you very much for participating and for your question. We really do appreciate that. Again, I just want to remind everyone who did register that you will be receiving an email with several links for information, also a link to the video. If you would like to share this, we would much appreciate it if you would. And if you have any questions, you can always email me, Karen Hickenbotham, at the email there, and or visit our operations management website. I will also include Dr. Ham's email in case anyone has any follow-up questions for him. So, Dr. Ham, thank you so much for your time today and your presentation. It was very informative. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it as I did. And we look forward to seeing everyone in either our next info session, or we will follow up with the link to register for our next webinar in October for change management. So thank you, and everyone have a good rest of the day.